I'd like to welcome you to the second Public History Unit talk of this academic year, entitled Power with Sir Christopher Clarke. Before I start, I'd also like to remind again to tweet to a very nice competition at QM_PHU with your thoughts, hashtag PHUPower, for a chance to win one of these man's fine books signed by the man himself. And before we start, I'd also like to thank the seemingly omnipresent and dedicated team of the Public History Unit, namely Joe Doran, who's just snuck in here, Sam Amos as well, and Patrick Higgins all the way at the back there, to name a few, who have been absolutely fantastic in putting these events on. I'd also like to thank the School of History for hosting this event tonight, Julian Jackson as well. Unfortunately, he can't be here, and those of us who do history know how busy he is. And if you're not here just for the after-wine reception, then I'd like to tell you a bit about this man right here. Born in Sydney, he was educated at Sydney Grammar School between 1972 and 1978. The University of Sydney after that, where he studied history. And between 1985 and 1987, he studied at the Freie Universität Berlin. He received his PhD at the University of Cambridge, having been a member of Pembroke College from 1987 to 1991. Professor of Modern History right now at Cambridge, and since 1990 has been a Fellow of St Catherine's College. In 2003, he was appointed a university lecturer in modern European history, and in 2006, a reader in modern European history. His Cambridge University professorship in history followed in 2008, and in 2014, he succeeded Richard Evans as Regius Professor of History at Cambridge, and in 2015, he was knighted in the birthday honours on the recommendation of the Foreign Secretary for services to Anglo-German relations. As for his work, his first book was the study of the relationship between Christians and the Jewish minority in Prussia between 1728 and 1941. He has published a study of Kaiser Welheim II in 2000 for the Longman's Pearson series Profiles in Power, as you can see, making him very qualified to give the talk today. Since then, he has published various articles and essays on related subjects. In 2004, he co-edited with Wolfram Kaiser of the University of Portsmouth an edited volume about the Kulturkampf between Catholic and secular social forces that polarised so many European states in the years 1850 to 1890. Professor Sir Christopher Clarke's research interests are centred on the history of 19th century Germany and continental Europe. His books include, of course, Iron Kingdom, The Rise and Downfall of Prussia, 1600-1947, a highly respectable book and one that received much critical accolade, including the Wolfson Prize for History. Another one of his books, which is on prize tonight, as you can see, The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, 2012, which won the LA Times Book Prize in History in 2013, beating Professor Julian Jackson's School of History option from this one. So I fear I may have embarrassed him too much, but without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for this evening, wonderful Sir Christopher Clarke.
Well, thank you very, very much for those kind words of introduction. Is this working, by the way? Yes. Good. There we are. Power is, which is the subject of my lecture this evening, is at once the most ubiquitous, the most ever-present, and also the most elusive theme of historical writing and thinking. Questions of power lie at the center of most historical narratives, whether avowedly so or not, yet the concept is rarely interrogated or analyzed by the historians who use it or work with it. There are studies that aim to clarify the differences between various types of power: financial power, persuasive power, normative power, military power, coercive power. It depends on which theorists you're looking at. They divide the salami up into different numbers of slices. But these sorts of studies tend to be written not by historians, but by sociologists or political scientists. And no consensus on definitions has ever been reached, or at least not to my knowledge. Even in the field of political and diplomatic history, where you would think power is really at the very center of historians' concern, the term is mostly deployed as a transparent signifier whose meaning requires no further or separate elucidation. By contrast with gender, say, or culture, power has never provided the kind of focal point for a subdisciplinary foundation that might have licensed a concerted theoretical and comparative engagement with the problem of power across the full spectrum of historical practice, so that we have gender studies and cultural studies, but there is no such thing as power studies. If you look up power studies on the internet, you get something like this. Why is this so? Well, the reason may lie partly in the nature of power itself. It is, as Thomas Buisson, a medieval historian, or he's not a medieval historian, he's a historian of the Middle Ages, has put it, it is so conceptually vast and so inscrutably inflated that one instinctively seeks to pluralize the word, powers rather than power. Power is not an identity that can be said to inhere in groups or individuals. Rather, it expresses a relational state of affairs. Power is thus neither a substantive entity nor an institution, nor is it even a possession, but rather it's an attribute of the relationships within which it's exercised. And it was in recognition of this feature of power that the most influential and I think also the profoundest post-war theorist on power, Michel Foucault, chose not to treat power under a separate rubric. So there is no book by Foucault called, The Adventures of Power or Power in All Its Varieties. He chose instead to embed his reflections in an analysis of specific institutional and disciplinary contexts and practices. From this, perhaps, flows the difficulty of power as an object of synoptic historical thought or contemplation, because the relationships within which it makes itself felt are as varied as the entire field of human experience. As a purely relational concept, it's often difficult to localize, and this may help to explain the perennial debates that are fought across academic history over the extent of the power wielded by specific institutions or persons. I'll be coming back to this in a few minutes, but think of the debate over how much power someone like Hitler wielded even within a system as concentrated as that of the Third Reich. At the very least, these debates about the amount of power located in a particular person or institution suggest a persistent uncertainty about how and where one should place power in complex systems, and whether its exercise depends more, this is another perennial debate, upon coercion, the coercion of the governed by the governors, or the consent of those over whom power is supposedly wielded. The bundling of meanings within the idea of power is another problem. Power and influence, though often used interchangeably, are of course not necessarily synonymous. Hence what the international relations theorist Robert Keohane called the cruel and ridiculous paradox of the influence of small allies. He was thinking of the sort of disproportionate influence wielded over American foreign policy by a relatively small state like the State of Israel. The boundaries between power and authority are also often blurred, despite the fact that there's a long European tradition of theorizing the relationship between secular and priestly authority in terms of the distinction between potestas, or sort of raw power, and auctoritas, or authority, on the other hand. Making sense of power has thus often involved disentangling the various different kinds of asset that may be invoked to sustain it. So in my lecture this evening, I'm not going to try to chart chronologically the evolution of historical power studies, because no such field exists. I'm not going to categorize the various ways in which historians have deployed the term power, because I doubt you'd still be conscious at the end of the hour if I did. Rather, I want to look very briefly at some of the configurations in which the operations of power have attracted the attention of historians. The powers and superpowers of the international system, power in the plural, power and personal dominion, the power of states, the ultra-concentration of power in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, its place in pluralist democratic systems, and its supposed diffusion in the era of what's sometimes called late capitalism. But I'm also aware that power is not a reality external to the historical sources that document it. It's not that power is out there and we have sources here that can help us to understand that thing out there. The sources that historians use are themselves often artifacts of power. Many of the archives historians labor in are in fact, and anybody who's worked in an archive will know exactly what I mean, they are fossilized remnants of once powerful bureaucracies, and archiving practices are often sort of fossilized versions of the record-keeping practices of what may be defunct or simply bureaucracies whose current business is conducted elsewhere. And historians themselves are not immune to the attractions and repulsions of power. So bearing that in mind, I want to close then with some brief thoughts on the subject of how the operations of power work upon the writing of history. Okay, so the rise and fall of states and the struggle for power among them is the oldest theme of historical narrative. Until well into the early modern era, it was conventional to think of world history as a sequence of hegemonies, starting with the Babylonians, then moving on to the Persians, often grouped together with the Medes, the Greeks, and then the Romans, and so on. And this way of structuring world history clung on, at least in the Western European tradition, in part because it was believed to be sanctioned by biblical prophecy. And I'm referring here to an extraordinary episode in the book of Daniel. Now, I'm sure this won't be necessary here tonight, but if I were giving this lecture to Cambridge undergraduates, I would at this point have to stop and explain to my audience that the book of Daniel is part of another book called the Bible. And that this extraordinary book, and a composite text written over many centuries, documents the behavior and the doings of a person called God. I don't have to do that tonight. But in any case, the book of Daniel opens with a scene involving King Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a sort of an eye of onyx showing the king, with his true name, of course, being Nabuchodonosor, a king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar II, incidentally, who reigned from 605 BC until 562 BC, 43 years in all. So this is a long reign, especially by the standards of the ancient world. Today he's mainly known both for building the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and for besieging Jerusalem and destroying its temple. So his career was, a kind of weird mix of the Chelsea Flower Show and Operation Desert Storm. The book of Daniel recalls a morning in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign after the sacking of the city of Jerusalem, an event which incidentally triggers or kicks off the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Judeans, a great sort of mythopoeic moment in the history of the people of Israel, the children of Israel. The king wakes up in this second year of his reign disturbed by a dream. He can't find rest. He summons his wise men. They're described in the Bible as the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans. Now, I meant to look up Chaldeans on Wikipedia and find out who they are. I've forgotten. They're always around. I mean, you've always got the astrologers, the doctors, the sorcerers, the soothsayers, and then the Chaldeans. One never really knows why they're there, but anyway, they all appear, and they ask the king to describe the dream. So you can imagine, they turn up confident. These are the holders of bureaucratic expertise. They turn up, of that day, of that era, they turn up and they say, okay, this is the kind of thing we can do, right? Tell us about your dream and we'll interpret it for you. But the king can't tell them about his dream. He says, I can't do that. It's going to be much less easy than you think. The thing is gone from me. Right? Now, we've all had that feeling, right, that the thing is gone. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's just gone. That's the king. It's a mournful acknowledgement. He can't remember this dream. It's gone from him. They're going to have to tell him what his dream was. At this point, the mood in the room plummets. The wise men, who are now not feeling very wise, try as gently as they can to break the news that their transferable skills, impressive as they are, do not include reading the minds of sleeping kings. And they say to him, it's, by the way, that below, the picture below is a sort of a Babylonian email of the kind that wise men use to communicate with each other. It's a rare thing, they say, that the king requireth. And there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So they say, not only can we not tell you this thing, there's nobody on earth who can give you this information you're requiring. Beneath the gaudily embroidered sorcerer's gowns, the perspiration is beginning to flow. The wise men start nervously touching their beards. It's a sort of Babylonian thing, and one can see why. Because a moment later, the king says, if ye will not make known unto me the dream with, you can see he's a scary-looking guy, right? There he is in stone. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. The argy-bargy continues, but the thrust of the king's position is already clear. You guys are a waste of space. What are you for? Why do I pay you? And then comes the climax. I order that tomorrow every wise man in my kingdom should be executed. This is Babylon's Michael Gove moment. This empire has had enough of experts. Okay, so the king's order, for obvious reasons, stirs consternation. Among those who are shocked to learn of it is a young Jewish captive. in effect a prisoner of war by the name of Daniel, a man of noble birth. But he's very young. He's probably of undergraduate age, 19, 20, perhaps 18. The book records that Daniel speaks well to one of the palace guards. Now, this is a feature of Daniel. He's eloquent. He speaks well. He's good at sort of, winning people to his cause. So he asks the guard, he says, "What's up with the king?" I mean, he says something like, "What aileth the king?" The guard I'm translating loosely here from the Aramaic. The guard explains. He tells him about the dream, the debacle with the wise men, and so on and so forth. Daniel is undaunted. He says, "Can you get me some FaceTime with the Neb?" The guard says, "Okay, but I warn you," he's very upset. Daniel goes to his friends. Daniel says, that's fine. Just get me into his chamber tomorrow morning. He then goes to his friends, where he shares a sort of apartment. 3 guys called Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Guys," he says, "let's pray to God for insight. And these are the words of the King James Version, let's desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret." Now, interesting enough, he doesn't say, "Let's pray to God to tell us what the dream was." He says, "Let's desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret." The next morning, he goes to the king. He explains the dream, framing it not just as a nasty nocturnal experience, but as a prophetic revelation. "O king," he says, "thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass." So this is the language of prophecy. And then comes the dream itself. The king, Daniel says, had beheld in his dream a massive, colossal figure. "This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Its head was of gold, as brilliant as the sun. Its breasts and arms were of silver. Its belly and thighs were of bronze. Its feet were of iron and in part of clay." And what does it mean, the king asked him? Great relief here for Daniel. I mean, at this point, Daniel's presumably thinking, thank God, he's accepted this dream as the dream that he's had. So he says, "Thou, O king, art this heart of gold, art this head of gold." He says, "Thou, O king, art this head of gold. For wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all." Now you have to admit, Daniel is handling this situation brilliantly. The king wants to know more. And what about the silver breasts? "After the golden age of Nebuchadnezzar, whose luster will never be outshone," Daniel continues, "will come a lesser age of mere silver, and then an even lesser age merely of bronze. And then will come a really crap age of just iron and clay, when men shall fight men and kings shall fight kings. And in the days of these kings," he says, "shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed." So then history will be over. The king's reaction to all this is extraordinary. And here's an image from a sort of rather insipid gospel website. The king's reaction to all this is extraordinary. "Then the king Nebuchadnezzar," this is the most powerful man in the world, incidentally, "then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him." Now, there are some further complications in this story. Daniel's relationship with the king later unravels a bit. There's a scary encounter with lions, which I'm not going to go into now. Nebuchadnezzar's mood swings get worse. There he is depicted by Blake on a really bad day during a 7-year stint that he spent living with beasts in caves. So things aren't, it's not all smooth sailing, right? But and the book of Daniel records various further dreams and visions, and Daniel gets into other hotspots. But it's hard to overstate the importance of this opening scene for our theme this evening. First, it's a beautiful and subtle fable on power. The most powerful man in the world is powerless before his night terrors. The holders of bureaucratic power, the experts, fail to come up with a solution and thus forfeit their power and indeed even their lives. Though it's important to note Daniel, being a sort of kind-hearted youth, the first act he does when he's been appointed viceroy after Nebuchadnezzar goes down on his face before him, the first thing he does is to declare that this order that the wise men across the kingdom will be executed is to be rescinded. And indeed it is. So the holders of bureaucratic power forfeit their power and even potentially their lives. And into this fraught constellation steps someone with no power at all, a rightless alien, a prisoner of war, a captive from a destroyed city. The jury is still out on whether God actually told Daniel the king's dream, or whether the young man didn't simply possess the human insight Remember, he desired of God mercies as to this secret. But it seems to me highly likely that what God gave him, or what he possessed, was insight, enough human insight to understand the true nature of the king's predicament. What could a man as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar possibly fear other than his own mortality? And how better to reconcile him with that terrible certainty than to establish his eternal primacy over the rest of human history, the rest of human endeavor, while at the same time imparting to the king something Daniel had himself learned as the son of a destroyed city, a piece of wisdom, namely that power is always temporary. This book, or rather this episode in the book of Daniel, laid the foundation for a way of thinking about the history of the world as the unfolding of a prophesied sequence of powers, a sequence of empires, of world hegemonies, a vision that remained hugely influential well into the early modern period and still wields profound influence in the world of rapture websites and telemillenarians. And here's a sample from a rapture website showing the colossus that the king saw in his dream, starting with the Babylonian Empire, then Media Persia, moving on to the Greeks, then the Romans, and then we have the end times. They're just coming along quite soon. So you start with Babylon, ancient Babylon. There's the famous Hanging Gardens. There's the Babylonian bull. Then you have the Medes and the Persians. You know, the Persians, well, we know who the Persians are, and they're still, very much alive and kicking today. We don't hear so much from the Medes. Not very expert on what happened to them, but anyway, that's a rare photograph of some Romans. And there's the book of Daniel, again from a rapture website. I warn you, you're welcome to go to these rapture websites, but I'd stay away from them if you have an allergy to nuts. Anyway, Daniel's prophecy imagined, in other words, world history before it had even happened as a sequence of powers, a sequence of hegemonies. And the grip of this vision really only began to weaken when the Saxon political theorist Samuel Pufendorf, along with various other German scholars, began to argue in the 17th century that the era of the Romans was over. And it might seem odd that it took people until the 17th century to realize that the Roman Empire had finished. But the reason people thought it hadn't was because they lived in something called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And it was widely believed or claimed that this Holy Roman Empire was in effect a continuation of the Roman times. And in fact, there are enthusiasts of these rapture sites who take the view that the Roman Empire is still in place until at the moment, because it's in place in the form of the EU. So there are those who take that and of the Antichrist in Rome. So there we have Samuel Pufendorf. Now, for what Pufendorf denied that the Holy Roman Empire was in fact a continuation of the old Roman Empire. He said, it's just a logo, right? It makes us sound good that we call ourselves Roman. It's in fact got nothing to do with ancient Rome. So he took a sensible, pragmatic line on that, and he was supported by numerous other scholars, and this became the kind of orthodox view. For what mattered for Pufendorf about history was not the diachronic sequence of empires unfolding longitudinally, as it were, with the passing of time, but rather the synchronic, simultaneous relations between empires existing within the same envelope of time. So in other words, what drove history was not some sort of prophesied sequence through time, but rather the interaction between powers in the same time, expressed in alliances, conflicts, wars. And of course, one thing about these interactions was that they were not foreordained, they were not prophesied, and their outcome was unpredictable. All conflicts have unpredictable outcomes. And of course, once you separated this story about what drove history from biblical prophecy, then the history of powers could unfold under the rubric of disruption and change. History could become a story of the continual iteration of new states of affairs brought about by conflict. And this is an idea of what history is that we in this room have all inherited. And yet the habit of imagining history as a succession of empires has been hard to shake. In the so-called Age of Empires, thus we've always been told in textbooks and so on, the Dutch succeeded to the Spanish and the Portuguese, then the English and the French succeeded to the Dutch, and then the British beat the French. So then it was the era of British Empire, and the Pax Britannica may have looked like a sort of modern repetition of its Roman predecessor, but even British hegemony, which was on a scale at that point unmatched by any previous empire, did not survive what Henry Luce called the American century. And of course, today we have a situation of American hegemony with a sort of gap in military potency between America and its nearest rival, which is greater than in any other point in human history. And from this arises one of the central questions posed by US political scientists, namely whether the United States, whose relative lead in terms of military power, as I've said, is unprecedented, will succeed in the medium and longer term in maintaining its leadership position. If all these other hegemonies were temporary, what about the American one? And of course, there's a lot of concern about that now. And in this context, there's been a lot of interest in something called soft power, a form of legitimacy generated by the dominant state's association with a universalistic culture. In other words, instead of power based on tanks and missiles and so on, power based on liberal or multilateral engagement with other states, attractive values, attractive cultural products, Hollywood, Coca-Cola, you name it. Soft power is important, the former US Secretary of State Joseph Nye has argued, because it aims to bestow legitimacy upon the external projection of power. And legitimacy is precisely what's often lacking when powerful states seek to apply force beyond their own borders. Projecting power in an environment where the locals don't want it or don't accept it has turned out, and this is a lesson that many humans have had to learn, to be an enterprise fraught with difficulty. The historian Arthur Schlesinger recalled, the great historian of the Kennedy presidency and a great associate of Johnson, great staffer at the White House, recalled that at the height of the Vietnam War, President Lyndon B. Johnson, and I quote, found it viscerally inconceivable that what the economist Walt Rostow kept telling him was the greatest power in the world could not dispose of and this is of course Lyndon B. Johnson's words, of a collection of night riders in black pajamas. So power in these context depends upon a paradoxical intertwining of coercion and consent, no matter how many carrier groups you have and how many smart missiles and even drones. It's very hard to project power without some measure of legitimacy and thereby consent. Not all power is governmental, of course, but the emergence and or decline of governments and later of state executives as the holders of a monopoly of legitimate violence, that's the phrase, charismatic phrase of Max Weber, has been one of the central European stories about power. It's a very dominant story in our discipline. Power can concentrate in governments, in states and bureaucracies, but it can also disperse again. The French medievalist Georges Duby described how the encompassing structures of the Carolingian Empire broke apart into ever more localized entities centered on the fortifications and military might of people called Caste Lands, men who controlled castles, soldiers, and horses. There you see, that's a Castellan, a fanciful modern representation of one. But you can see the difference in the type of power. You see, you have officials who have Latin titles, you have written law and sort of resembling almost a constitution, you have public ceremonies and so on. Here you just have this guy saying, "You looking at me, mate?" Like that. So, or know where you live. It's that sort of situation. And the argument being that as power broke up and got devolved down to these more localized power holders, its character changed. Its exercise became less public, more closely associated with the relationships of proprietorship. It took on more aggressive and more exploitative, more in-your-face forms. But this period of fragmentation was followed, according to some scholars at least, by the rise in turn of new forms of government. And here we have Lorenzetti's allegory of good government in Siena. We need not concern ourselves with the details of these arguments or with the scholarly controversy over their veracity, which is immense, as you can imagine. But more important from my point of view this evening is the underlying logic of the narrative. Power is in flux. It disperses, it becomes localized, and in doing so, it changes its character. Then it's refocused on a higher plane. And these changes help to explain why power is constantly obliged to legitimate itself anew. The very expectation that power should have to legitimize itself implies, as the historian of Germany David Sabine has observed, that the idea that power should legitimate itself implies that it is in some sense always arbitrary. Come in. I'm only halfway through. Implies that it is in some sense always arbitrary, that its exercise requires justification or perhaps masking. Many medieval scholars would have agreed. They took the view, this was the normal view in fact, the dominant view among early medieval and high medieval moralists. They took the view that institutions of dominion, of human power over other humans, were a thing of the devil, rooted in the sinfulness, the fallenness of man. Insisting on the godliness or virtue of the prince was one way around this problem, though not an especially good one. But it's striking that the most influential early modern theorists of legitimacy, namely Machiavelli and in particular Thomas Hobbes, reframed the problem of legitimacy, deriving it not from the personal characteristics, the personal traits, godliness, virtue, goodness of the prince, but from the functional utility of sovereignty as an agency, as an institution, as a guarantor of order and social peace. I mean, here's the Leviathan, who I must say, it seems to me, is rather similar to the ghastly colossus that poor old Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, or that Daniel persuaded him he'd seen in his dream. But I mean, whether or not this massive creature, composed of millions of other human beings, whether or not he's a nice person, where he stands on animal welfare issues, whether he pays his television license or not, these are not questions that are important. What matters is, does he keep the peace? And is he necessary to keep the peace? Even in eras marked by the concentration of power in states, uncertainty remains about how exactly power is distributed, given that relations of power so often masked or have masked and do mask relations of interdependency. We think of the late 17th and 18th centuries, in particular in European history, as an age of absolutism. That's a term that has really not gone away. Yet the term absolutism remains controversial. In fact, there's a book called The Myth of Absolutism by Nicholas Henshaw, which argues that it is exactly that, a myth, that absolutism describes something that isn't actually there. It's a piece of propaganda. Even under Louis XIV, one could argue the state was still very small. Kings still needed the support and know-how of provincial elites, not to mention their patronage networks. If Peter the Great of Russia attacked and undermined the privileges of the old Russian nobility, Catherine the Great, his successor, but not quite one, reversed the polarities of the state-building process, handing power back to the nobilities, moving it back, re-provincializing it, moving it back into the localities. Even after successive generations of Hohenzollern monarchs had eroded and worn away the foundation of provincial aristocratic power in the Prussian provinces, the political life of the Kingdom of Prussia was still marked by what one German historian, Wolfgang Neugebauer, has called a corporate latency, a semi-concealed or a semi-hidden form of aristocratic provincial governance. And the concentration of power through processes of state building, absolutist or otherwise, whether we want to use that term or not, is not a uniquely European phenomenon. In China, one scholar has suggested the state structure endured through the centuries precisely because successive generations of rulers, of emperors, succeeded in forging an alliance with local power holders. That was what made the imperial power so strong and so enduring. But the relationship between the imperial center and the periphery changed markedly over time, as local chieftains, especially in the non-Han Chinese peripheral areas of the empire, but in other areas too, gradually accumulated more and more power to themselves, sucking it away from the center. But then along came the Yongzhen emperor, who came to the throne in 1723, who resolved to do away with these local chieftaincies. His vision of the state as a centralized entity was offended by the imposition of native chiefs between himself and some of the people. He thought of himself as an unmediated ruler of all of his subjects. He didn't want middlemen. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled through provincial potentates known as the Daimyos, who gradually acquired increasing independence. And here again is this familiar dialectic. The Daimyos in the localities started out. There's Tokugawa Mitsukuni, who was also, he was the third son of Tokugawa Yorifusa, and he was the second daimyo of the Mito domain. The daimyo, the shoguns got weaker and weaker, the daimyos got stronger and stronger, and in the end you had a kind of multitude of little Japans with their own coinage, their own customs, their own taxes and customs. In other words, a sort of complete breakdown as they sucked power out of the center of the shogunate and accrued it to themselves. And some scholars have argued, paradoxically, that it was precisely these growing limitations to shogunal rule that explain the longevity of the Tokugawa dynasty. It hung on precisely because it was weak at the center and because power was franchised out in a way that from some perspectives was actually very efficient. The state, of course, is not the only show in town. there have been non-state environments. One interesting one, which there's been a lot of interest in recently, has been the American West, a temporary non-state environment on the fringes of the sort of imperial expanding, or rather expanding colonial state of modern America. Another is Mexico. There's been very interesting work on how the power of the Mexican state throughout much of the history of that state peters out once you raise the altitude. If you go up into hills or mountains, the state's power is scarcely felt. So power and altitude exist in a direct ratio with each other. Why should the 19th century Igbo of what's now central Nigeria, why should they have established a state? Nobody in their vicinity threatened them. There was no pressure on them to create state-like institutions, so they didn't. They had one of the most decentralized systems of human sort of community management known to history. Of course, and this phenomenon has often been connected with what's called the great unfinished drama of African statehood. But there have been very sophisticated and centralized African states. The Buganda followed a pattern very like the Western European absolutist pattern. It was situated, of course, and this is part of the reason why Buganda took the course that it did, it was situated in the extremely resource-rich and very densely populated Great Lakes region of Africa. But if Buganda was powerful, it was not necessarily highly centralized. In Buganda, too, the central court of the Kabaka, the authority of the Kabaka, there we see one of the last Kabakas, if the central court of the Kabaka wielded power, but only through local so-called Saza chieftains. And here, as in early Tokugawa Japan, the center was only powerful to the extent that it successfully co-opted the local holders of people and resources, of power over people and resources. And in Buganda, as in Tokugawa Japan, the military chiefs who had initially been installed in order to reinforce and project the power of the center ultimately mutated into political rivals of the central authority who sucked power out of the center into the peripheries. And that is one reason why the Bugandan state no longer exists today. Even the historical study of totalitarian systems, as they're sometimes called, Nazism, Italian fascism, and Stalinism, is marked by what might seem an extraordinary degree, given what looks like an immense concentration of power. That's what the word totalitarian means, the total concentration of power within the state. There's no power outside it, supposedly. But even these states, the historical study of these states, is marked by uncertainty, or at least debate and contention, over the degree of power concentrated in particular institutions and individuals. Was Hitler a weak dictator, as one book has called him? Or was he master in his own house, as another book has called him? You have Robert Galately writing on the Gestapo, saying, yes, the Gestapo is a very fearsome institution. If they catch you, you can be tortured, you have no rights. Civil rights have been completely suspended in the Third Reich. That's a terrifying prospect to fall into their hands. But he makes the point that in the very large industrial city of Essen, the total number of Gestapo personnel was 7. He makes the point that almost all Gestapo investigations were launched on the back of denunciations. In other words, that the Gestapo depended as much on the public as the Metropolitan Police in London do on, Crime Stoppers and other sources of information. They couldn't simply launch investigations off their own bat. They didn't have the resources to do it. So even the Gestapo depended upon the consent, the willing consent and support of a large part of the population over which they supposedly wielded power. Sarah Davies, a social and cultural history of Stalinism, makes a similar point. Lynn Weiler has focused on peasant resistance to collectivization. And it's an interesting feature of the history of the study of the Soviet Union that in the era when we didn't have access to archives, that the history of the Soviet Union tended to stress the power of the state. But once the archives opened up, new studies emerged which examined the social textures of Stalinism, and interestingly enough, the power started to shift. And it looked more and more as if, for example, Stakhanovite workers, the subject of a wonderful study by Robert Thurston, could wield power themselves. They could actually bargain with the regime, and certainly bargain with their own local power holders, including members of the local functionaries of the Communist Party. The Italians, of course, invented the term totalitarismo, but did their state ever live up to the claims of the concept? And that, of course, is a very doubtful claim, as many histories have now made clear. And if power is hard to locate in highly concentrated, hyper-centralized systems, like the Third Reich of Stalinist Russia or fascist Italy, it must be all the more so, all the more difficult to locate in the hyper-complex, democratic, pluralist societies of late capitalism. And here I want to cite the only piece of advice that President Lyndon B. Johnson ever gave to Richard Nixon. Nixon had just been elected. He was the president-elect, and he got a call from Johnson, and Johnson said the following: "Before you get to be president, you think you can do anything. You think you're the most powerful leader since God. But when you get in that tall chair, as you're going to find out, Mr. President, you can't count on people. You'll find your hands tied and people cussing at you. The office is kind of like the little country boy found the hoochie coochie show at the carnival. He'd paid his dime and he got inside the tent, and then he came out saying, 'Tain't exactly as it was advertised.'" I'm not even going to say anything about what a hoochie coochie show is. I think you can probably all guess. But in any case, in fact, the history of the American presidency has been an education in the fluidity of power, and we're going to see this again in the coming months and years. When the British journalist, businessman, and essayist Walter Bagehot, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Bagehot, it looks like Bagehot or something like that, but anyway, it's Bagehot, contemplated the United States in 1866, shortly after the Civil War. He produced an essay called Presidential Government, in which he compared the presidency to the British monarchy. He said basically they're a monarchy. They've become a monarchy. The president is their king. But when Woodrow Wilson, here he is here, when Woodrow Wilson, an admirer of Bagehot, turned to the same problem in the 1880s, he called his essay Congressional Government. America had passed through the era of Reconstruction, and the legislature was now dominant. Indeed, the president was no better placed the President, Wilson argued, is no better placed to shape legislation than, and I quote, "any other influential person who might choose to send to Congress a letter of information and advice." And yet when he revisited, this is Mr. Wilson himself, when he revisited the same problem, oops, wrong here, going back here, oops, come to that in a moment. When he revisited the same problem 10 years later in a further major study, Wilson took a different line. Americans, he wrote, now viewed the presidency as the unifying force in our complex system. And this, of course, reflected the ascendancy of Teddy Roosevelt, who had transformed the place of the president within that complex system. And we find similar fluctuations in other presidential systems. This is one little example of what happened during the reign of Nicolas Sarkozy. He seemed at first a very powerful figure, comparable with Napoleon, and then we see a couple of years later the Economist mocking him as the incredible shrinking président, walking along behind, his charismatic partner, the chanteuse Carla Bruni. And you can make the same kinds of point about the role of the Bundespräsident in Germany and the Bundeskanzler, the Chancellor in Germany. The German constitution, as designed by the founders of the Bundesrepublik, of the new Germany that emerged after the Second World War, had no idea that the Chancellor would come to play the dominant role that she today plays. Does anyone really know where power resides in the European Union? I mean, I've never met anybody who does. When you start reading your way into the political science literature on this question, you find that the scene is dominated by great ideological encampments. They're like 17th century armies. You have the intergovernmentalists. They argue that control of the EU is exercised by the member states, either alone or in combination, dispersed across them. By contrast, neo-functionalists stress the role of supranational institutions, especially the European Commission and, in more recent times, the European Parliament, though the relative weight of these two is, of course, itself constantly in flux. Institutionalist and networkist approaches emphasize the limited potential for the concentration of power in any one part of the EU. Power, they argue, can only be exercised when very large and composite coalitions involving actors of different kinds, member states, supranational institutions, societal alliances, or advocacy coalitions flow together in support of specific objectives. Then things can start to move. Power relations are thus played out in the context of what's often been called a multi-level game, involving many different kinds of state and private actor and structured around informal network-like relationships. In an extraordinary book called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, a lyrical, often perverse diagnosis of late capitalism, published in 1972 and 1980 and consisting of these two volumes, The Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, the French post-Marxist leftists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari fixed their eyes on the United States and saw there a new kind of social order in which power did not flow from a single center and was not anchored in a single core structure. In place of arboreal tropes, metaphors involving trees, root and branch, for example. In fact, there's a chapter which begins with the words, down with trees. They said, we want no more tree metaphors. Shut up about trees already. In place of arboreal tropes that opposed center and periphery, roots and branches, Deleuze and Guattari imagined what they called the 1,000 plateaus of capitalist society, a world of, these are their words, multiplicities, lines, strata, and segmentarities, lines of flight and intensities. They metaphorized the postmodern social and political order as a rhizome, it's a botanical term meaning a root system. A rhizome, a capillary network in which every point was connected to every other point. An array in which power centers were, and these are their words again, diffuse. Oh. Yeah. An array in which power centers were diffuse, dispersed, geared down, miniaturized, perpetually displaced. Now, this is really a remarkable book. These two books are a remarkable experience. I used to think they were unreadable, but then I realized that my mistake was to try and read them. Don't read these books. Bathe in their emanations. Observe them through a curtain of gauze. Place them in a cool, dry place for a few months. Diagnose them. If you approach them in the expectation of encountering a sequence of falsifiable propositions that add up to an argument, then the whole enterprise is bound to end in tears. Read it as poetry. I mean, this is a book whose chapter titles include, and I quote, 10,000 BC, A Geology of Morals. Page 47, one of my favorite, I mean, there are hundreds, but page 47 is one of my favorite, contains a wonderful, you should read it it doesn't matter in what order you read this stuff, by the way. Page 47 contains a wonderful exhortation to the reader, and I quote, admire the tortoise. Well, I mean, what a fantastic piece of advice. I think we do too little of this kind of thing when we write. A paragraph on the same, because, anyway, you can't be reminded often enough of how admirable the tortoise is. A paragraph on the same page opens with the guileless announcement, and I quote, we are a little lost now. Well, there again, one can only agree. And here are the authors on a sort of theory top trumps card. It's a fantastic thing. You can see that what I like about this is it says strong analytic Marxist foundations. This is put together by some Californians, you can tell, Californian students. Special skills. Super postmodern terms are really cool. And here they are again. This is a very important picture because the one on the left in particular shows us something that's very rarely been photographed, namely a French intellectual actually thinking. That's what it looks like. Now, whether power is ever really as flatly distributed, as geared down, as Deleuze and Guattari proposed in those two books, is debatable. Certainly what must strike anyone who's worked with the kinds of sources historians use is the asymmetries of power that shape them. Whether or not power is inscribed in stone or on paper. I'm going to do my best to make this last part really worth your while. Now, whether it's inscribed in stone or on paper, historical narrative, as Michel Rolf-Trouillot has observed, involves the uneven, and I'm quoting, the uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means for such production. In other words, the means required to produce the things we call sources. The things we have from the past, or the things we have of the past, themselves bear the imprimatur of power. Consider the contrast between two palaces. This is they're both called Sanssouci. This one is in Millau, in the north of Haiti, not far from Cap-Haïtien, the palace of the first Haitian king, Henri Christophe, known as King Henri I. His was an extremely turbulent reign. There we see a picture of him there, and one of the coins that he issued in 1820, which he appears in the, in the clothing of a Roman emperor, or resembling a Roman emperor. But his was a turbulent reign. It didn't last very long. He committed suicide in 1820, and 11 days later, his son and heir, Jacques-Victor Henri, was bayoneted on the steps of that palace by Republican revolutionaries from Port-au-Prince. Power, in other words, moved away from the palace of Sanssouci in Millau, away to the south, and today the palace looks like this, even though it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And here is the other Sanssouci, built in the 1740s by Frederick the Great of Prussia. Today it looks, except for the style, of course, as if it were built last week. And the reason for that is that power has always stayed with this building. Power never left this structure. Both the Weimar and the communist regimes maintained it as a treasure of state heritage, and to this day it remains exactly that. Okay, well, it's time for me to come to a close. Historians respond to the asymmetries of power in a range of ways. Some are attracted to the spectacle of power. They're drawn to it, the social locations in which it's exercised. They write about cabinets, antechambers, military headquarters, ministries and boardrooms. They admire the skillful use of power. They're almost erotically drawn to it, or so one feels sometimes when one reads their prose. They baptize it in approving rhetoric. Others work against the gradient of power, from the bottom up. This was the aspiration of that social history of the 1960s and 70s, which placed at the center those individuals and groups who had previously figured as the anonymous objects of policies devised by the powerful. In some such narratives, conceived in the paranoid mode, it's power that's then anonymized. Power becomes anonymous. The textured portraits of leaders make way for faceless elites and ruling classes. But some historians who focus on subaltern actors find, on the contrary, that power pools around the objects of contemplation. The more they know of their protagonists, the more power, at least over their own destinies and immediate environments, these protagonists seem to wield. They find wit, strategy, determination, autonomy, and resistance among peasant women, Soviet steelworkers, forest dwellers, slaves, and prostitutes. Writing in this mode may come to seem a retrospective act of empowerment, or perhaps it's just that narratives require protagonists who in turn demand a piece of agency, and with it a small share of power. The reasons for making such narrative choices, which all historians of course make, it's always implicit, doubtless lie, leaving aside the trends that push historical writing this way and that, within the realm of what Judith Butler has called the psychic life of power. We're accustomed to thinking of power as something out there that presses in on us from outside. But what if we ourselves, as Butler suggests, are actually initiated through what she calls a primary submission to power, the power, for example, of our parents? If, Butler suggests, we understand power as a force in our own formation, as subjects, then power, and I'm quoting her now, is not simply what we oppose, but what we depend on for our existence, and what we harbor and preserve in the beings that we are. In The Trial, a haunting literary reflection on the nature of modern power, Franz Kafka describes a man engaged on an ultimately futile quest to locate and address the power that will determine whether or not he is found guilty of a crime that he's unaware of having committed. His efforts to secure information about his case, as it's called, my case, have you heard anything about my case, turn up nothing but hearsay and conjecture. And when he finally locates the room where his judges supposedly convene, he finds a chamber that is empty, except for an elderly, and judging from his contribution to the conversation, possibly demented janitor with a broom. In a beautiful essay on this book, entitled Kafka vers une littérature mineure, Gilles Deleuze discerned in this bleak fable an analogue of Kafka's own hopeless quest to come to terms with his domineering, overbearing father. Because in his letter to his father, Brief an meinen Vater, an incredibly powerful piece of writing, Kafka's rage at the patriarch who overshadowed his youth is muted by the recognition that there was another father before this one, a patriarch every bit as overbearing as that of the son who would later tower over young Franz. The one who wielded power had first been obliged to submit to it. If the line of flight from father to father to father has no end, then perhaps there can be no terminal reckoning with power. Thank you.
Thank you again to Christopher Clarke for that wonderful speech. We have a couple of microphones, I believe, floating around somewhere that we may... we've got one up there, and the other one is over there. So they'll float around. We're going to have a question. Yeah, ask that for a few. So if anyone has any questions for Sir Christopher Clarke, just raise your hand and we'll come find you.
So you've talked about various powers and leaders throughout a range of time periods. Shall I start again?
Oh, no, you're just trying to find where you are. Sorry.
So you've talked about various powers and leaders and how they rule throughout a range of time periods. Which leader and or nation do you think had the most impact on the world?
Which leader and or nation had the most impact on the world? Okay, that's interesting. Well, actually, I'd have to choose Genghis Khan, I think, although I know nothing about him. But only because I remember seeing a really fascinating documentary about Genghis Khan, which said that there is more of Genghis Khan's DNA in the rest of humanity than of any other individual. And this suggests that Genghis Khan wielded quite extraordinary power. If you can measure power in sort of access to reproductive opportunity, then Genghis Khan scores probably higher than any other human being. This, of course, is not a form of power that Adolf Hitler was interested in, for example. But nevertheless, I mean, it depends on how you measure influence and power. Another immensely influential leader, I suppose, is Lenin, because the transformation of the Russian state that he, with the help of many, many others, accomplished, really was wielded an impact that was global in scope. But in the end, the top trumps game of impact is a difficult one to play, because there's always someone else that you can come up with. Charles V would be another possibility. Martin Luther, you don't have to be the leader of a state, you could be the leader of a religious movement, whatever. So I hope that's an almost adequate answer to your question.
In terms of power, which world power do you believe had the most responsibility for the outbreak of the First World War?
Okay, right. There, I'm going to really have to disappoint you here, because I know people love to play the blame game and to say that power is the one that did this terrible thing. And it's true that the literature on the origins of the First World War, when it asked the question, why did this war break out, the why question often, it turned out, really contained a concealed who question. Who did this terrible thing? And the answer, of course, that became popular in this country and from the 1970s and 80s and 90s, in fact, right up till quite recently, was Germany. And the situation was helped by the fact that a very influential study by a German historian, Fritz Fischer, made exactly this case and said, where to blame? We're the ones who started this war. That's not my view. My view is that the Germans didn't plan this war. They were certainly very happy to risk a war and very happy to, as they would have put it, accept a war. If, for example, Russia mobilized, they weren't going to go out of the, they weren't going to dodge that war. They were going to counter-mobilize and accept the war that was offered as they saw it. But they were not the only power that behaved in this high-risk way. We find the Russians also planning for an imminent conflict. We find voices in Paris saying, we need a war, and the sooner the better. We need one that will start in the Balkans. That will be convenient for us. Of course, there are the Austrians, who were perfectly happy to risk a European conflagration in order to settle their affairs with Serbia. So I think what you see when you look at Europe in 1914 is not a kind of peaceful suburban park, in which the Balkan states are sort of swinging on the swings, and France and Russia are playing one of those chess games with stone pieces, and Britain's falling asleep under a willow tree or something. And into this park comes a sort of staring, screaming psychopath called Germany, waving a samurai sword. I don't think it's that kind of scene. I think that Europe in 1914 was a very, very dangerous continent, occupied by powers, all of which were prepared to risk a horrific war in pursuit of their own interests. What's really missing in 1914 are the statespeople, they're all men, in fact, the statesmen who were willing to put peace above everything else.
Hi. I think the discussion that most of us have been either involved in or just overhearing a lot quite recently is the discussion, of course, around the power of Trump, or the power to be of Trump. And I just wonder what you think of the basic level of that discussion, because, I mean, quite often it feels as though there's been a certain naivety to the way in which we're talking about power in relation to him. And I wonder whether, what you think about the way we are discussing power in relation to Trump, and whether we need to have a better understanding of it in the coming years.
That's an extremely interesting question. I mean, I think that the sophistication of the discussion of Trump varies hugely. There's a very broad spectrum, and of course the panic that one senses in a lot of the discussion of Trump is understandable, given the kind of provocative quality of this personality. I do think it would be helpful for people to address the issue a bit more through a precise analysis of what exactly are the mechanisms that someone like Trump will be able to activate or not. I mean, a lot will depend on the kinds of alliance building he's able to indulge in. I mean, in particular on the loyalty of the Republican Party, or the homogeneity of the Republican Party, and whether he's able to reunify the party around his own objectives. Because if he's not, then he may wind up being a very loud but ultimately lame duck president. But even if he has the support of the two houses, there are many checks on his power, especially in the domestic setting. He can set the tone, and he will doubtless do that in ways which may be quite damaging. But whether he can actually change things on the ground is another question. Where he will be able to make a difference is in areas that have to do with special powers, areas that have to do with national security. So although he's unlikely to be able to introduce a registry of Muslims, that would affect citizenship statuses right across the country. That's very unlikely. On the other hand, he will be able to, I think, reactivate the registry system that was used under the Bush presidency after 9/11. So those sorts of areas within the rather narrow domain of presidential prerogative in questions of national security, he will doubtless be very active in those areas. Foreign policy is another question, because actually the president has a lot of room for movement in foreign policy. And it remains to be seen how he will behave in that setting. But of course, foreign policy is paradoxically, though it seems to us to be the ultimate field in which power is wielded, actually, foreign policy is a funny area, because the president has no direct control over any of his partners. The partners are all sovereign agents or agents of other sovereign powers. So there's a paradox about foreign policy, that you're locked in a kind of game where you actually, in the end, have very little in the way of direct sanction over any of the other partners in the game, the other players of the game. So I think that a bit more in the way of a calm analysis of the constitutional instruments that he's likely to be trying to use would be helpful, and understandable it is, perhaps a little bit less panic.
One last quick one.
At the end of your lecture, you were talking. Hi.
Okay,
you were talking about individual power,
Yeah.
but then earlier in your speech, you were saying how for example, the Gestapo relied on public consent for their power. So, in your opinion, what do you think what can individual power do in relation to history?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think that what strikes me about it, the power of individuals, is that it's a sort of artifact of the way you do history. I mean, if you zoom in on a particular individual, like, for example, I don't know if anybody here has read that book, The Cheese and the Worms, about a North Italian miller, I think he's a miller, if I recall correctly, who starts kind of inventing his own theology. And then he starts talking to people about it, and this gets him into trouble, and so on. And in a marvelous book about this man, because pieced together from the Inquisition records, Carlo Ginzburg, reconstructed his life and presented him as a remarkably autonomous individual subject, just sort of putting things to, a bricoleur, someone who's putting together reality for himself, despite the sanctions against it. Now, in the end, the powers around the power distribution between him and the Inquisition proved to be so asymmetrical that in the end he was burned at the stake, which is not a good outcome, obviously, for this exchange. But the point is that if you focus on individuals, the more you know about them, the more powerful they come to seem. So, in a way, the powerlessness of the powerless was in part the artifact of a history that was focused very much on governments and sovereigns. And so in part, I suppose the answer to your question would be that you cannot fully separate the question of where power lies from the question of where you look for it. When you direct your attention in a particular direction, power will tend to, and autonomy will tend to pool around that object of contemplation. I hope that's an answer of sorts to your question.